Hello, I'm Zosha, one of the Programme Officers here at People's History Museum, the National Museum of Democracy and home of ideas worth fighting for. Today, I'm going to be taking you on a tour as part of the Heritage Open Days Festival, where we'll be exploring their theme, Hidden Nature. We're going to discover stories about those who have campaigned for nature and the environment in Britain over the last 200 years. Does that surprise you? Environmental appreciation and activism have a much longer history than you might have thought, and it's a history to which many people have contributed. From romantic poets, Victorian factory reformers and advocates for the countryside, to anti-nuclear protesters and students striking as part of the Fridays for Future movement today. So let's head back 200 years ago to see where it all began. Environmentalism began in the early 1800s through the existence of another movement, Romanticism. Romanticism placed a lot of emphasis on nature, wanting people to appreciate places like woods for their beauty, challenging the mainly scientific view many had of nature at the time. Around the same time, in 1824, French mathematician Jean Fourier calculated that the Earth's atmospheric gases trapped heat and that the atmosphere acted like an insulator for the Earth. His ideas were the first formulation of what we now call the greenhouse effect, and so knowledge and awareness of global warming was beginning to emerge too. The greenhouse effect is essential for sustaining life on Earth, but human activity, mainly through the burning of fossil fuels, have increased the amount of these greenhouse gases, resulting in the warming of the atmosphere. There's now widespread concern that this warming is going to have a catastrophic effect if it's not prevented or reversed. So our story starts today with the Industrial Revolution. Whilst many people celebrated this new manufacturing age, others recognised that with this progress came environmental problems. Can you imagine all those factories pushing out that pollution into the air and water around them, expanding out into farmland, with chemical contamination and atmospheric pollution from all the smoke causing haze, and diseases such as cholera spreading across towns and cities, which became increasingly crowded. All this was happening whilst there were no environmental regulations to control it. Factory reformers, green space advocates, smoke abatement societies and activists all became pioneers in the environmental activism movement, making a connection between a healthy environment and a healthy society. One person who made these connections was John Ruskin, a Victorian art teacher and social reformer. He had strong views on the environmental impact of industrialisation and was angered by the ugliness, pollution and appalling living conditions it created. And he argued that cities should have a belt of beautiful garden and orchards around the walls, so that from any part of the city, perfectly fresh air and grass might be reachable in a few minutes' walk. His views influenced the Garden Cities movement that appeared in the 1900s, along with the establishment of the principles of the Green Belt. From here, looking across to Salford, I can see very little green space. Maybe you are lucky enough to have green space on your doorstep, or maybe your view is similar to mine. Ruskin was also influential for other social reformers and campaigners, and one of those was Octavia Hill. Octavia was a social reformer and one of the three founders of the National Trust. She worked tirelessly to improve urban houses and protect green spaces. We're still feeling the impact of her work today, and her beliefs in the importance of access to nature for human well-being and the need to stop the destruction of natural landscapes. In 1864, Octavia used money from John Ruskin to buy neglected property in London, transforming them and in turn changing the lives of the tenants in those buildings. From her time on these housing estates, she became convinced of the need for open spaces for the urban masses, fresh green away from the city smoke. She joined a campaign to save Swiss cottage fields from development, and although the campaign failed, she met Robert Hunter, who was the solicitor for the Commons Preservation Society. Together, they campaigned for land and successfully managed to resist development on Parliament Hill, Vauxhall Park and Hilly Fields. Along with Hardwicke Rawnsley, in 1895, they went on to found the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest and Natural Beauty so that green spaces could be kept for the enjoyment, refreshment and rest of those who had no country house. Octavia continued to fight for the preservation of the countryside until she died, helping the National Trust buy and protect its first London properties, as well as campaigning for the preservation of footpaths so everyone had the right of access to land. She was a strong-minded person, and some of her views are not without controversy. She believed that private enterprise and charity were preferable to state government action when it came to solving social inequalities. So, for example, she was against providing council housing or a universal old-age pension. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, the origins of political attention to environmental issues developed, and they fell broadly into two categories: public health and sanitation, and concern for landscape and habitat preservation. So before we head upstairs to continue the story, I just want to show you two banners in our collection and take a closer look at the natural imagery used on them. Over time, political parties, trade unions, movements and campaigns have all used natural symbolism to convey their messages. This is the Primrose League banner of the Stretford habitation made around 1900. The Primrose League was a grassroots organisation which aimed to spread conservative principles. The primrose was chosen as it was the favourite flower of the Conservative leader Benjamin Disraeli. This banner is decorated with garlands of the yellow flower around a central crest. Now this one is the Hampstead Labour Party banner, made in the 1920s in an arts and crafts style. It carries the words, "The earth for all, not for the few." The woman in the middle, with her red cap of liberty, is casting seeds onto the ground where we see a cockerel around her feet. And around her head is a wreath of ribbon-bound laurel and rays of sunshine. Like John Ruskin earlier, members of the arts and crafts movement disliked the harsh realities of industrial Britain. They longed for a move back to the rural tradition, and many of them moved out into the countryside themselves, where they produced their crafts. This in turn influenced the labour movement, as many key members of the movement were socialists, including William Morris and Walter Crane. Getting out into nature was also a key feature of the socialist societies, like the Clarion Club. So let's head upstairs to hear more about one of the members of the Clarion Cycling Club and the protest he led. After the Second World War, the Labour government is well known for introducing the welfare state, applying the recommendations from the Beveridge Report, which aimed to wipe out poverty and hardship in society. However, one of its least recognised legacies of that Labour government is the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, which was passed in 1949. This was the culmination of a long campaign to protect and increase the rights of ordinary people to access the countryside. This campaign had its roots in the walking boom of the late 1800s, and in the 1870s and 1880s saw dozens of walking and rambling clubs set up across Britain as people sought to get away from those increasingly crowded cities. These clubs soon ran into problems with access, as much of the countryside was closed off to the general public, which was a long-term consequence of the Enclosures Act, which started in 1604. And so, the access movement was born. In 1884, a bill to increase access to the countryside was introduced in Parliament, but it was voted down, and similar bills were presented every year and defeated annually until 1914. At this point in time, there was no collective voice for walkers in the UK, and the walkers' ability to support bills in Parliament was very limited. However, many of them used the only way of expressing their views they had available to them, which was by petitioning. Dozens of petitions were submitted to Parliament throughout the 1800s, and one Liberal MP who supported these was James Bryce, who in the 1892 Access to the Mountains Bill paid tribute to all of those who had been petitioning during the debate. The access movement gradually became more and more organised in the first decades of the 1900s and continued to push for access legislation. When British interest in the countryside grew in the 1930s, the movement really expanded, and it took off with the iconic mass trespass of Kinder Scout in 1932. There'd been mass trespasses before, but the scale of Kinder Scout and the outrage at the harsh sentences handed down to those who had organised it provided a huge impetus to the campaign. One of the main organisers was a man called Benny Rothman. He'd grown up in Cheetham Hill, which is a densely populated working class area of North Manchester that's not too far from here. And like many in this part of the city, he was the child of Jewish migrants. Through his work as an errand boy in the motor trade, he was introduced to the Young Communist League and Clarion Club, and in his spare time, he enjoyed discovering the countryside, and like many, joined the Clarion Cycling Club. His political and outdoor interests naturally came together, and in his late teens he helped to establish a Lancashire branch of the British Workers' Sports Federation, which was a communist-inspired organisation that had already led successful campaigns for sports facilities in Tottenham. The Federation held camps and trips, and it was at the Easter 1932 camp where the idea for the Kinder Mass Trespass only a few weeks later came from. On that day, the 24th of April 1932, Benny led hundreds of campaigners from all sides of the peak up Kinder Scout. Can you imagine what that would have been like? As I know, it's very physically demanding, even in good weather. At the time, Benny was 21, and he received a 4-month jail sentence for his part in organising the trespass. When the Countryside and Rights of Way Bill was presented in Parliament in 1949, it was passed with all-party support. Over the last 70 years, it's changed the way we interact with the British countryside, and that long campaign, which started with those petitions in 1880 and included that mass trespass, had succeeded, and ordinary people's relationships with the countryside has changed. We can't think about environmental history without mentioning the 1970s. They're known as the decade of the environment and were started by the first mention of the phrase "our environment" in a political party conference speech by Howard Wilson, which took place at the Labour Party conference in 1969. Over the 1970s and 80s, there were growing concerns over acid rain, rainforest destruction, industrial chemicals and the plight of marine animals. And it was during this time that new mass movement environmentalism was championed by the Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, both of which were founded in 1971, followed by People, which went on to become the Green Party. Radical eco-politics were developed by Earth First, whilst the Green and Common Women's Peace Camp led a grassroots feminist campaign against the military-industrial complex, and both of these provided the activist foundation for today's Extinction Rebellion. So let's have a look at one of the museum's most recent acquisitions and see how people are continuing to campaign for the environment today. The climate emergency we're currently facing requires immediate action. It's one of the most threatening crises of our time. For over a year, thousands of students all over the world have walked out of lessons to protest about climate change, and in current circumstances have taken those protests online. This placard was collected from the first youth climate strike, which took place in Manchester on the 15th of February 2019. One of those who attended the climate strike was 10-year-old Lilia. She's passionate about the planet and making sure that it's a safe place for everything and everyone that lives on it. Each Friday, she attended the strikes in St. Peter's Square here in central Manchester, with the Fridays for Future group. She even attended a strike on her birthday in the rain. And why, you might ask? Because in 11 years' time, the time scientists have said we have to stop the climate warming process, Lilia will be 21. With the Fridays for Future group, she's campaigned for the UK to declare a climate emergency, which they achieved along with other groups in May last year. She's also campaigned for Manchester City Council to declare a climate emergency and to stop investing in fossil fuels. She took part in Extinction Rebellion's Northern Rebellion last year, as she would like the government to tell the truth about the reality of the climate crisis, but also act on it and to hold citizens' assemblies. That would mean people would have a say on how we tackle the climate crisis, and for Lilia that's really important, that people of all ages have a say in our future, especially those young people, as it's their future who will be impacted most.
Over the last 200 years, there's been many campaigns and movements, and Lily is just the latest in a long line of activists campaigning for our environment. Thank you for watching this tour. I hope it's given you an insight into the last 200 years of environmental activism, and that you want to find out more about the hidden campaigns for nature. Let us know the stories of your campaigning in the comments below.